exploring something that might surprise you. How the simple act of walking or hiking can fundamentally transform who you are as a person. This isn't about fitness goals or step counts. This is about discovering why some of history's greatest minds did their best thinking while walking, and how putting one foot in front of the other can reshape not just your body, but your character, your resilience, and your entire outlook on life. Whether you're feeling stuck, overwhelmed, or simply looking for a path to becoming your best self, today's conversation might just reveal that answer is literally right outside your door. So let's dive in and explore how movement and physical activity can move you toward the person you're meant to be. Welcome to Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz, where academic rigour meets real life. I'm Dr. Stephen Stolz, educator, philosopher and academic at the University of Adelaide, and this podcast series is my quest to help everyday people access research-based ideas that feed curiosity and foster deep thinking. In today's episode, I explore the topic of physical activity in its various forms. I consider how physical activity in the form of walking can enhance creativity and problem solving, have a positive impact on our physical and mental health, and is part of a rich historical intellectual tradition. Beyond these known benefits, physical activity has the potential to be transformative in the sense that it can change you in positive ways that can be good for you. I consider the benefits of physical activity to improve both physical and mental health, and then I address the question of step counts and also review the research surrounding the pleasure of physical activity that is known as the feel-good effect. As a means to shift the narrative surrounding physical activity and to make sense of the subjective dimension as it relates to our understanding of health, I present the case for health through finding and growing physical activity playgrounds that have the potential to be transformative and often equated with and part of what is known as the good life. At the end, I outline some practical tips and ideas to get you moving. Whether you suffer from poor physical and mental health, or you are just interested in learning more about the benefits of physical activity in its various forms, or you want some practical tips and ideas to get you moving, then today's episode will provide you with both the intellectual framework and practical insights to navigate this important area of life. By the end of our time together, you'll understand the benefits of physical activity on the mind and body, and also discover the interrelationship between the good life, health, and physical activity in its various forms. So join me as I bridge the gap between evidence-based research and everyday application. This is Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. When you walk or go walking, do you get moments of creative inspiration? How about problem solve an issue that has been on your mind for a while? Now, I'm asking you these questions because there is something about walking that I find transformative, because I get some of my best creative ideas and actually solve some of my biggest problems when I've been out and about on one of my old man walks. Now, if you're wondering, I call my daily walks old man walks, because my pace varies depending on how I feel on the day, and I actually love to listen to podcasts while I'm out and about walking. Some days I actually do feel like an old man, and some days I don't, but I do find if I don't exercise frequently, I actually do feel more like an old man than normal. For me, I try to go for a 60-minute walk every day with the aim of hitting 10,000 steps on my Fitbit device. Now, on the question of step counts and how many steps you should aim for each day, I will address some of these issues later in this episode, so do make sure you stay tuned in to the end. That said, I want to just return to the topic of walking, creativity, and problem solving, because it's really uncanny how often that this has actually occurred to me whilst I've been out and about on one of my old man walks. In fact, I've now made a habit of going for daily walks that I've grown to love walking so much that I toyed with the idea of actually calling this episode My Love Letter to Walking. Now, producer Luke, the truckie from Peachtree, initially made fun of me when I pitched this idea to him in a production meeting. But I can now report he has grown to love the idea, particularly when I told him that I see walking as part of what I call the health through finding and growing movement and physical activity playgrounds that actually have the potential to be transformative and actually often equated with part of what is known as the good life. I also think that producer Luke also saw the benefits of this episode too, because he also likes to go for old man walks as well. Now, before I move on to my next point, it is worth pointing out that recent research from researchers from Stanford University, and the title of this research that I'm referring to is Give Your Ideas Some Legs, the Positive Effect of Walking on Creative Thinking, and it's published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, and the details will be in the episode and descriptor. And they found that walking boosts creative ideation in real time and shortly afterwards. Not only does this research confirm intuitively what I knew to be the case about walking, and others I've actually spoken to about walking as well, but it does raise a range of very interesting points I want to cover in this episode. Now, I do actually think this article is a useful starting point, and that's why I've mentioned the title of the paper, and actually we're going to put the details in the episode descriptor so you can have a look for yourself. But briefly, I've summarized this research into three broad themes. And so the first one is, and I've called it enhanced creativity. And it says that walking, especially in natural environments, so just think outdoors, in green spaces, which I actually love, have actually been shown to boost creative thinking and problem-solving abilities, allowing individuals to generate more ideas and think outside the box. So just think kind of lateral thinking and so on. And then the second theme I discovered from this paper is what I've called physical and mental health benefits. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in this episode as I go along. But basically in this paper, it refers to the act of walking actually increases blood flow and oxygen to the brain, which can improve cognitive functioning and mental clarity, leading to more effective brainstorming sessions. So employers, managers, leaders out there, just think productivity. Gotta love productivity. We've got to be productive out there, don't we? Anyway, the third theme I've called break from routine. Now, this means stepping away from traditional workspaces, like getting out of your office or your open plan space and just going for a walk in a green space. And by engaging in that physical activity of walking, you can actually get a fresh perspective. So it helps you overcome maybe mental blocks and actually help stimulate innovative ideas, particularly if you go walking with someone. Anyway, if anything, my own experiences continue to confirm this time and time again. And again, I know from talking to my colleagues who also walk a lot, they too report the same benefits. For instance, I know from talking to producer Luke, he also tells me he gets the same type of benefits. And I know this from talking to other people as well. So hence why I'm kind of sharing it now in this episode. So I do think we're on to something here that is worth sharing with everyone. And I guess that's why I'm kind of talking about it now. Now, how about you? Do you notice the same benefits when you go walking? I want you to think about that. Beyond these actual benefits I've just mentioned, I also myself like to think of my daily walks as being part of a historical tradition, actually rich intellectual tradition, where I see myself following in the footsteps, and no pun intended here, of intellectual giants like Beethoven, Goethe, Dickens, Darwin, and my intellectual hero, Nietzsche, who all became peerless walkers of legend. Now, for instance, Beethoven was an avid walker. He would take short breaks to stretch his legs while working and then spend his afternoons wandering around Vienna. He always took a pencil and paper with him to write down anything that came to him whilst he was walking. You can see, or rather hear, the influence of these woodland walks in his symphonies, particularly his Sixth Symphony, known as the Pastoral Symphony for its country and woodland elements. Then there is Goethe, another genius from this period who was a passionate walker, who saw it as an essential part of his life, a way of experiencing the world and connecting with nature. He incorporated walking into his daily life, whether for health, observation, or just simply enjoyment, and saw walking as a way of life that was more than a means of transportation, but a way of thinking, seeing, and interacting with the world. Another of history's walking enthusiasts was Charles Dickens. Whether in London or at his country house in Kent, he always took long walks. And when I say long, I mean actually really long. I mean, Dickens could rack up to like 30 plus miles a day, or rather at night sometimes he would go walking. And he would walk whenever the mood took him and whenever he had something to think about. And he would just continue around the streets of London or the country lanes of Kent until the issue was resolved in his head. I definitely understand what he's getting at there. Another intellectual heavyweight with another Charles, but this time Charles Darwin. Darwin had a gravel path installed at his home, not unlike a racetrack, that he would walk around each day as he thought about problems. And the number of laps he did depended on the difficulty of the problem at hand. And he would stack up stones at the start of the walk and knock them down one by one as he went around, describing the difficulty of the problem as a 3, 4, or 5 flint problem, for instance. I actually happen to like that idea a lot. Maybe I should get a racetrack or walking path in my backyard. Anyway, now this brings me to my intellectual hero, Friedrich Nietzsche, who actually became a walker of legend who took long walks. And it was on these long walks he would work while he was walking. For instance, the section, The Wonder in His Shadow, which is taken from Human or to Human, was actually famously scribbled down in pencil in a small notebook whilst he was walking alone for up to 8 hours a day in the mountains. It's actually quite fascinating to see his handwriting. You can see that online if you're really interested in this. And during Nietzsche's productive years, he wrote some of his greatest books, and the value of walking took on a quite unique significance to him that not only brought him great joy and happiness and respite from his various ailments, which he was famous for, but gave him a unique perspective about the world that was actually quite liberating. Now, I could go on and on and on about Nietzsche, and maybe in future episodes I might do a dedicated episode on Nietzsche, but producer Luke has actually told me off for spending too much time talking about Nietzsche. And he wants me to mention modern or well-known people from this historical era, like Steve Jobs, the late Apple co-founder. Now, I should point out that producer Luke loves Steve Jobs. He loves Steve Jobs. However, as I've already mentioned in previous episodes, I'm actually not a big fan of Steve Jobs. And I could talk at length about that, but I'm not here to talk about Steve Jobs. But anyway, that's a conversation for another time. In saying all of this, Steve Jobs was well known for using walks as a tool to brainstorm new concepts for problem solving and to foster creativity. So he does get a mention for those things that he's well known for. And another well-known person who deserves actually a special mention actually is Oprah Winfrey. I have a lot of respect for Oprah. And if you're listening, Oprah, I'd love to have you on and as a guest sometime. That said, Oprah has spoken quite openly and passionately about the benefits of walking. For instance, Oprah has been vocal about her wellness journey over the years, and walking has been actually quite a core part of her fitness regime for quite a long time now. And Oprah credits walking with helping her maintain her weight and boosting her mental health. And in an episode of Oprah's Life Class, and feel free to check that out online, she shared that walking not only keeps her physically fit, but also helps her clear her mind and de-stress. And I would agree with how walking can do those very things. Oprah once even completed a 10,000 step challenge and spoke about how empowering it was to hit those milestones. And I would actually have to agree with that. It can be quite empowering. As she has shown, walking isn't just about physical fitness. It's a way of actually reconnecting with yourself and focus on your overall well-being. And I guess this is why Oprah gets a special mention, because I like how she acknowledges that walking is actually more than fitness. Anyway, before I move on to my next point, I want to consider an artistic depiction of walking. And when you think about walking, what work of art comes to your mind? For me, when I think of walking, I automatically think of Caspar Friedrich's artwork titled Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. Now, in this artwork, Caspar Friedrich's painting depicts a lone figure, a wanderer, standing on a rocky precipice overlooking a sea of fog that fills the landscape below. It's a great painting. Absolutely love it. The central figure is a young man, possibly actually Friedrich himself, if he's back to the viewer, suggesting introspection and contemplation. He is dressed in a dark green overcoat and leans on a walking stick as he peers out over the vast expanse of fog below that actually obscures the lower part of the landscape, creating a sense of mystery and the unknown. The jagged peaks of mountains rise above the fog, suggesting a rugged and challenging terrain. Now, I love this painting. I really do. In fact, I love it so much, I actually have a print of it hanging over my desk in my study. In fact, I look at this painting daily, and I really do. I look at it daily. And as an interesting thought experiment, I try and imagine that I'm standing exactly where the solitary figure is standing. Now, usually I'm left in awe, and I wonder at the vastness of nature, while at the same time, I actually feel a sense of mystery of the unknown because the fog limits human perception. Now, another telling theme emerges around the journey of self-discovery with determination and a willingness to confront the mysteries of life. And I could go on and talk about this painting, but now I just want to turn to the question of step counts and how many steps you should aim for each day. Have you heard about the recommendation of walking 10,000 steps per day as a health goal? In my preparation for this episode, I actually wondered where this idea of 10,000 steps came from. I was actually quite surprised to learn that the idea of walking 10,000 steps per day originated from a Japanese pedometer marketing campaign in the 1960s. I have to admit this did surprise me, and yet the idea has become a popular health goal. For instance, my Fitbit device that I wear, I actually get rewarded if I reach or exceed 10,000 steps per day. Now, even insurance companies have become obsessed with biometric data like steps per day. An obvious example is AIA Insurance, who reward its members with a range of benefits and rewards if they link their Fitbit devices or other health devices to the AIA Vitality app on their phones. Benefits and rewards can actually range from discounted gym membership, sports shoes, exercise equipment, all the way through to $5 gift cards if you reach a certain exercise goal. Now, I know a lot about AIA and the AIA Vitality app because I use it myself, and this is why I wear a Fitbit device, because of the benefits and rewards. But this is a conversation for another time. Now, anyway, back to the question of step counts and how many steps you should aim for each day. Now, some of you may be surprised to learn that there is actually really limited scientific evidence to support 10,000 steps as the actual optimal number of steps for health benefits. In fact, there's a lot of actual mixed messaging out there around the number of steps per day we should be aiming for as a health goal. So let me clarify a few key points so we can limit the confusion. First of all, I need to stress that this is about getting out and about. So any physical activity is better than no physical activity. I guess that's a bit of a no-brainer, and I'm kind of stating the obvious there, aren't I? But really, that's a really excellent starting point here as we talk about this very question. Now, the research is quite clear here. Compared to those who walked approximately 2,000 steps per day, it was found that 7,000 steps per day was linked to better health outcomes across a range of areas like reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, depression, and so on. It's a reasonably long list. Even 4,000 steps per day was linked to better health outcomes compared to approximately 2,000 steps per day. Now, if you're wondering, 7,000 steps per day is actually a useful guide, but I need to stress that some physical activity is better than no physical activity, and ideally start with low-impact physical activity like walking, particularly if you're starting from a very low level of physical inactivity. Now, the second point I want to make is it's better to focus on time spent doing physical activity over step counts. I think that's the other point I want to make here as well. Now, I know I mentioned 7,000 steps, per day as an approximate guide, but the type and time of physical activity matters more than step counts. For example, the World Health Organization, WHO is the acronym they use, recommends adults should do at least 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity or 75 minutes of vigorous aerobic activity every week. And if you're wondering, that equates to approximately 21 minutes per day of moderate physical activity or approximately 10 minutes per day of vigorous physical activity. Now, notice the time and the type of physical activity here, because moderate aerobic activity or vigorous aerobic activity, all right, they are important kind of categories. So you're probably wondering what this means. Well, look, as a general guide, think of moderate aerobic activity as any physical activity that gets your heart beating faster and actually makes you breathe harder, but still allows you to carry on a conversation, say if you're walking with someone. And I just want you to think brisk walking as an example right here. As for vigorous aerobic activity, this is a type of exercise that significantly elevates your heart rate and breathing, and it makes it quite difficult to say a few words without pausing for a breath. So it actually becomes quite difficult to kind of hold a conversation, particularly if you're with someone. And it involves activities that require a high level of exertion or pushing your body to its limit. So just think jogging, running, running up and down flights of stairs and so on, if you're really into that kind of stuff. Later in the episode, I will outline some practical tips and ideas to get you moving. So do stay tuned in for that at the end, please. By now, you're probably wondering what science has to say about physical activity in its various forms and why it's important to engage in approximately 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity or approximately 75 minutes of vigorous aerobic activity every week. And that's an obvious question to ask. Now, for the purposes of background context, from around the 1980s and 1990s, physical activity was framed around reducing the risk of physical health problems such as cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, and so on. It's a reasonably long list. And much less attention was paid to the contribution physical activity could have on the prevention and treatment of various mental disorders, illnesses, and just general mental malaise. The case for physical activity in reducing physical health problems is actually reasonably well established, and there's a fair bit of scientific literature that supports the importance of physical activity in reducing physical health problems. And there's actually now a growing interest in the contribution of physical activity in the alleviation of mental health problems. For instance, can you prescribe physical activity as a treatment for mental health illnesses and diseases? Can physical activity be used as a means for coping and managing mental illnesses? And can physical activity be used as a means for improving quality of life for mentally ill and as a means for preventing the onset of mental health problems? And this is where some of the research is going at the moment. Now, either in terms of clinical or non-clinical conditions, physical activity may offer substantial potential alone or even as an adjunct in improving mental well-being for many individuals, actually. For example, there are 5 important benefits that actually are associated with the use of physical activity for health and well-being. And I'm just going to list some of these very quickly. So the first one is physical activity is actually quite cheap or inexpensive. And for example, going for a walk doesn't actually really cost money. It doesn't cost money at all, actually. So that's the first one. So that's a real benefit for a lot of people out there, including myself, actually. The second one is physical activity carries negligible side effects when it's actually low impact. For example, walking should not harm you, and it shouldn't actually make, if you have a injury or illnesses or whatever, shouldn't actually make your condition worse. Probably shouldn't be exercising if you're ill or sick. But my point is that it shouldn't actually harm you. Third one is physical activity can be self-sustaining in that it can be maintained by the individual once habits have been formed. For example, generally it takes about 66 days for a new behaviour to become a habit. And this time frame, it can actually vary from person to person, but it actually depends on the complexity of the habit. And for instance, some habits can form in as little as 18 days, while others may take up to more than 600 days or even longer to form. The key is just making it a regular part of your daily routine, really is the key here. The fourth one is, given that many common non-drug treatments or interventions such as cognitive behavioural therapy or CBT, which we've actually talked about in previous episodes, can actually be quite expensive, short supply. It's actually been quite difficult to access a clinical psychologist, but it is worth considering all options and strategies anyway, so it's all part of the mix here. For example, effective lifestyle interventions or changes can actually be used to both prevent and treat a wide range of mental health problems and also improve just general overall quality of life. And the fifth point here is, given the known benefits of physical activity on health, it's also worth promoting physical activity because of the positive impact it can actually have on mental health. Now, one area of research that is interested in the impact of physical activity on mental health is the phenomenon that has come to be known as the exercise-induced feel-better effect or feel-good effect that was actually operationally defined around the 1970s and 1980s. And it was actually used as a mean to measure post-exercise anxiety reduction or alleviation and mood enhancement. For example, positive mood shifts. And by the end of the, kind of 1990s, the feel better phenomenon has actually morphed into well-known published statements like exercise or physical activity makes you feel better, or it actually improves your mood. You actually hear that a lot. In order to kind of understand this research, an understanding of the dual mode theory, which is actually matches affective responses to the domains of intensity, and these domains being moderate, heavy, or vigorous, and severe, are really important. Now, these exercise intensity domains, the ones that I just mentioned, moderate, heavy, or vigorous, and severe, are really important for a range of reasons, but think of them more like a roadmap for your body. And this knowledge is actually really helpful for determining which gear to use for different goals and situations. So let me briefly explain each domain so you have a general sense of what I'm talking about here. So let's start with the moderate domain. And I know I've talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm just going to cover it in a little bit more detail. Now, in the moderate domain, you can exercise for long periods without any fatigue, and your heart rate, oxygen uptake, and blood lactate remains quite stable, and your body remains in a steady state of what they call homeostasis. And an example is long walks or easy walks at a low intensity, and you can walk for long periods of time without kind of feeling, kind of like you're exerting yourself or getting tired. As for the heavy or vigorous domain, it begins with exercise exceeds what they call the ventilatory threshold. So this is actually where you can't hold or maintain a conversation. It was a bit like what I said earlier about, think about if you're with someone, you can't really maintain and hold a conversation. You might be able to say things, but you definitely can't hold a conversation. And your body's steady state or homeostasis actually gets disrupted. And your stress response kicks in, and this is where your lactate builds up and stress hormones increase. And depending on your level of fitness, you actually might reestablish balance after maybe several minutes, but generally your body is under stress. An example of this is just jogging, where breathing becomes harder, and just say you're at a high intensity, and think of it like that as an example. And in the severe domain, like the category says here, the intensity exceeds respiratory compensation point. And this basically means you just can't maintain a steady state at all. And that results in you being forced to stop because you have reached your physical limit. So you've literally reached your limits. You have to stop. An example of this is sprinting and high intensity intervals. At some point, no matter how hard you go, your body will stop, no matter how much you've trained. So what's actually interesting about this research is actually two things. So there's two things that are really interesting, and I'm just going to share these with you. So the first one is most healthy individuals report stable or increasing levels of pleasure during exercise, but typically this follows by further improvements during the post-exercise period in the moderate domain. For example, within the moderate domain, the predominant response is pleasure, and there is some variability in the heavy domain, with some individuals reporting increases and others decreases in pleasure. And of course, the severe domain, the predominant response is displeasure. Obviously, it's very stressful on the body. So that's very interesting. Post-exercise, there's a period of pleasure, okay? And that's part of that feel-good effect. The second point I want to make is that typically, once the strenuous physical activity is stopped, there's actually a rapid, at least among physically fit individuals, an instantaneous affective rebound from negativity to positivity, consistent with the feel better effect or feel good phenomenon mentioned earlier. Now that is interesting. Now this is known as the affective rebound that occurs after a bout of physical activity that leads to a post-exercise state that is more positive than the pre-exercise one. So that's a good takeaway. So the post-exercise rebound occurs at the cessation of physical activity, and it's actually short-lasting. Now, whether this is in response to the physical activity itself, but rather to the cessation of the physical activity, is something they're trying to actually determine through research. So too is the science around the endorphin hypothesis, which you might have heard of. which claims that the endogenous opioid peptides are released in the human brain where they modulate affective processing and pain perception. And that's that pleasure as a reward that we've been talking a little bit about. However, I need to warn you, after more than 30 years of research, the endorphin hypothesis is still under critical debate because there's no direct proof in humans that exercise or physical activity-induced mood changes actually directly induced by endorphins in the central nervous system. Whatever the research might find, it will be interesting, but we shouldn't lose sight of what we already know from research. And this being, the more pleasant the physical activity, the more likely an individual will engage in physical activity. Now, it just sounds so simple, doesn't it? But it's actually quite tricky and complicated. Of course, this proposition is an open question because the type of physical activity is a subjective one. Now, there is also the logical question to pose, and I've always wondered this myself, to be honest, is if physical activity is so pleasurable, then what accounts for the persistently low rates of physical activity participation that we see in contemporary society? It's actually fallen off a cliff. Now, there are actually no easy answers to this challenging question. But before I move on, let me recap a few of my main points. Now, the exercise or physical activity-induced feel-better effect or feel-good effect, it's actually not universal. I just want to be quite clear about that, despite the fact that it has now become a well-known phenomenon. For example, it's typically associated with moderate levels of exercise intensity. And I guess that's why people who are addicted to exercise are chasing this feel-good effect all the time. Now, herein lies the challenge. To keep people physically active and thus enable them to benefit from the effects of physical activity, it actually must be pleasant, whatever that actually might mean for an individual. So this is the subjective dimension of physical activity we're all trying to unlock for ourselves. As simplistic as this may sound, when physical activity is unpleasant or not enjoyable, we drop out, we stop exercising. And it just makes sense, doesn't it, on a very intuitive level. And which leads to an even poorer state of physical conditioning and perpetration or a continuation of the vicious cycle. The key is to shift the narrative. And in order to do this, we need to make sense of the subjective dimension as it relates to our understanding of health. And let me explain. Often the case for health, say through exercise and physical activity, assumes we will respond to common sense or appeals to rational self-interest to become more active, which in turn will produce important positive health and well-being benefits, right? Often, physical activity is promoted and designed to be pleasant, perhaps even fun, and often framed around the message, physical activity is good for you, so you must do it. Up to a point, this may be true, particularly if you lead a sedentary life. And as a result, any physical activity is always going to be good for you if your starting point is nothing, right? Of course it is. Now, as mentioned earlier, physical activity, just for health reasons, becomes a really hard sell, which many people simply don't buy because extrinsic values depend on intrinsic worth. For example, it's not the experience of running, lifting weights, and so on that we want. Rather, we normally value something, say in the case of physical activity, because it cultivates a longer, more productive and meaningful existence. I really want to emphasize that point, actually. Where great end values exist, the means that get us there take on greater value. The converse is also true. Where there is little end value, the value declines accordingly. Now, this dependence on end values, that being health and well-being, raises serious questions about putting all our motivational eggs in the extrinsic basket, even though strategically sometimes they might need to go there. Now, the real problem is that pleasure is fleeting and the fun wears out very quickly. And what's novel and pleasant today often becomes distasteful and feels like really hard work tomorrow. Now, while pleasure and fun may get people moving for a while in the short term, it is typically not enough to overcome deeply ingrained sedentary habits. This is why a comprehensive approach to physical activity has to speak to all sides of the human equation, and that's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, not one over the other. And this is why I want to instigate a kind of counter movement, really, of sorts, that approaches physical activity in its various forms as a form of play that's actually both necessary, inherently meaningful, and valuable to the individual as part of the good life. Now, there is something to be said about approaching health as a form of creating movement and physical activity playgrounds, because human beings are built to play. And when we engage in deep play, it becomes inherently and personally meaningful to us to the point that it becomes part of our subjective identity. If anything, deep play is the ultimate because it's transformative in the sense that it can change you in positive ways that are good for you. Indeed, the potential of physical activity to transform someone is actually more about forging a subjective identity through repeated encounters with a place and its inherent requirements. Now, in order to make sense of my point here, I think it's actually quite useful to provide an example to elucidate my point. Take, for instance, my love of multi-day hiking and camping, and I seriously love hiking and camping. I really do. And I do practice what I preach. I really do. So some are actually quite surprised to learn that I fell out of love with hiking and camping for a while. And actually, this really bothered me for a long time. It really did. And after a period of personal reflection and soul-searching, it actually dawned on me that I was actually hiking and camping for the wrong reasons. And these reasons being a checklist of well-known and famous trails I wanted to complete. And the list represented a checklist of achievements that are probably best categorized as extrinsic motivators. And in one sense, there is a sense of self-liberation in actually knowing why my love of hiking and camping actually slowly diminished over time, particularly when things got tough on the trail. And anyone who's been on tough multi-day hikes will know what I'm talking about here, because a trail can be both physically and psychologically challenging. And in another sense, it's one thing to know why I fell out of love with hiking and camping, and a completely different thing to know how and why I fell back in love with hiking and camping. Now, I mentioned the latter because it's important to my earlier point about how physical activity can transform someone. And let me explain. Recently, I completed a multi-day hike with my daughter. A big shout out to my daughter, Rebecca, if you're listening. And we did this recently during winter on the Wild South Coast Way Trail from Cape Jarvis to Tapanapa, which is part of the Hayson Trail. I believe they pronounce that Hayson Trail here, that goes through Deep Creek National Park. Now, the multi-day hike was 2 days. On day one, we got lucky with the weather, with some sun, and it wasn't too hot or cold, and the weather was perfect, actually, for the trail. And more importantly, the trail had plenty of spectacular views to keep us occupied and engaged. Plenty of unbelievable views of Kangaroo Island. It's just spectacular down there. It really is. Then on day two, it was the complete opposite. The weather was dark, it was cold, it was wet, it was windy, and the conditions on the trail were really tough, actually bordering on dangerous in parts, because it was really hilly, it was muddy and slippery, with limited to no views of anything other than just really dense scrub bush that actually all looked the same. Now, this is where my story of subjective transformation makes sense. My 2 days on the trail that I just described is like an analogy for life. Everyone wants their life to be like day number one. And we work hard to avoid days like day number two. But the question to ask is, why do we work so hard to avoid days like day number two? Now, the idea that our life will always be like day number one, it's actually really an illusion. And for me, when I'm lucky enough to have a day like day number one, I'm actually genuinely grateful. I really am. Now, the reality is that our life is more like day number two. And yet, why do we try so hard to avoid and deny our life? I certainly understand why fear may be the main driver in this avoidance. I really do. In the same way we might fear a dark cave. But I've come to realize that day number two is more like a dark tunnel. And this is kind of shifting that narrative that I was talking about earlier. Because I think we have the narrative all wrong when it comes to days like day number two. And I think we should flip that narrative. And how we can do that is we need to think about day number two differently. So rather than avoid days like day number 2, I think we should confront and embrace days like number 2 or lean into them and do so with courage and self-conviction. Yes, I was definitely both physically and psychologically challenged on day number 2. And I sometimes felt like giving up, but I didn't, of course. But I came out the other side of the dark tunnel into the light as a much better person as a result of the experience. And more importantly, learnt more about myself in the dark tunnel that I can actually take with me on the other side of the tunnel in light as I live my life. This is the subjective transformation I was telling you about earlier that's actually so difficult to qualify. One thing is really clear here is that we should take note of these subjective stories that transform us, because inevitably this is about what we value. And what we value directly connects with notions of the good life. So I ask you, do you have any subjective stories that have transformed you? If so, then I would love to read them and maybe share them with others in an appropriate forum, with your permission, of course. Now, if you are interested and willing to share one of your subjective stories, then feel free to send me your story at deepthinking@stephenstolz.com. Now, what do I mean by the good life? Indeed, this is actually a really good question. And I wonder if you've ever wondered what the good life means to you. To me, the good life refers to the experiences and conditions of living the way we regard as desirable. While most people aim for good living in one sense or another, we disagree about what exactly it entails. For example, for some, the good life includes things like owning a home in a nice neighbourhood, maybe having 2 cars, being happily married. I think that's important, particularly if you're lucky enough to get married, having a successful career, and so on. Now, I completely get those. For others, the good life is being healthy and happy, or maybe perhaps rich and famous. These are all part of sometimes what people consider to be leading the good life. Although there may be disagreement around what constitutes the good life, generally the good life consists of the subjective values an individual chooses to rank order in their life. And I think that's really what I'm getting at here. Indeed, value choices are actually unavoidable. And how we rank order our values says a lot about who you are at a certain moment in time. And generally, in making value choices, we consider things like short and long-term benefits, benefits for ourselves and others, and benefits as ends in themselves and a means to other ends. Often, what drives our rank ordering of our values revolve generally around 3 things. And I'll just go through these very quickly. As I've mentioned already, intrinsic value is so important. So that's the first one. And generally, values that are good in themselves are superior to values that lead to good things. So generally, this means intrinsic value counts more than extrinsic value. Since this is a subjective value, it depends on what you intrinsically value. And this is why it's actually connected with something you enjoy or you find satisfying. And some examples could be just reading for fun, playing music, maybe painting or drawing, learning a new skill. It's actually quite a long list, and it's an individual, dare I say it, personal thing sometimes. The second one is satisfaction. All else being equal, experiences that include satisfaction carry more intrinsic power than those that do not. And this is why intrinsically valuable experiences that include durable satisfaction count more than those that lack it or are fleeting. And the third one, and this is a biggie, is meaning and purpose in life. Now, a coherent and meaningful life brings with it a durable sense of satisfaction. For example, intrinsically valuable experiences that promote a coherent and meaningful existence generally count more, particularly if they are connected with a person's life. That is why that story I shared with you before will stay with me for the rest of my life, because it was meaningful, really meaningful experience, which I shared with my daughter. Now, so by now you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with physical activity in its various forms? Now, this is actually a logical question to ask at this point of the episode. Now, at the end of the day, we cannot make physical activity any more important than it is, nor can we force someone to engage in physical activity, particularly if they don't want to. I mean, seriously, why would you force someone to do something they don't want to do? In fact, it's very counterproductive. Nevertheless, the earlier framework that I mentioned is useful for understanding why we engage in physical activity and what we could become or be. So I want to finish with 4 models of an active lifestyle that are actually worth considering. And these models are not meant to be comprehensive or mutually exclusive or even definitive in any way. If anything, they do actually overlap at times and develop together in some form or another. Regardless, I actually do think they are quite useful to outline some useful models for an active lifestyle to get just a general sense of how the good life, health, and physical activity can be meaningfully interrelated and are intended to get you thinking about potential active lifestyle models that actually flip that narrative that I was talking about earlier. And I will go through each one quite briefly and succinctly. Now, the first model is the strenuous life. Now, according to the strenuous life, the good life is built on doing, suffering, and creating. So it's easy to see how physical activity is conducive to cultivating this view in some form or another. Now, the crux of this model is concerned with notions of quest or journey in meeting challenges. So this is not necessarily about achieving some end or goal, but just more about the journey, a little bit about my trail story that I was sharing with you before. And the second model is the sensuous life. From this perspective, the good life is concerned with sensual experiences or aesthetic delight through physical activity. Now, when physical activity engages with our embodied dimension, these experiences become actually quite significantly meaningful and actually quite satisfying when they are connected with our senses like our smell, our vision, our hearing, and so on. And the core of this model revolves around the many ways in which you can access our embodied dimension through active types of experiences. And with the right type of training, education, and practice, it's actually possible to make these embodied experiences meaningful and personally satisfying. The third model is the spiritual or the transformed life. Now, spirituality, broadly defined here, is concerned with theistic and non-theistic commitments that have the potential to change our lives significantly. And of course, there are well-known examples of religious pilgrims. For Muslims, it's to the Hajj. For Christians, there are a whole range of different pilgrims, actually, and I can just list quite a long length in other religions as well. But from this perspective, the good life is the transformed life, one that has been moved in a significantly positive direction by an experience or some other dramatic change in one's quality of life. Now, whether spirituality is the best term here, it's actually an open question because you could go with transformative or transcendental experiences, which are well reported by many who engage in repetitive type of physical activities like long-distance running or swimming, hiking, and so on. So I gave an example before of a transformative experience that is secular. It's got nothing to do with religion. So here the model is concerned with a transformed life for the better. And you can see why this model is so attractive to so many people, because it doesn't really have to involve a theistic. It can actually be quite non-theistic or non-religious, secular if you like. And the last model is the excellent life or the life of excellence. Now, the last model is somewhat controversial because excellence can take many forms. Now, that said, it may be useful to view the model concerned with a life of balanced excellence. I think that's the way I'd prefer to view it. And aspirations to achieve excellence in everything we do is actually quite a solid foundation for pursuing many things. And when balanced with the knowledge and skills to achieve what we set out to achieve, provides quite a level of freedom and autonomy that's actually quite attractive to many people. Here, the last model revolves around the constant striving to do our best and striving to do better than last time. Inevitably, the good life involves physical activity in some form or another, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that human beings are built to move and find meaning in the world through movement. So I ask you the following questions. Which of these models do you like and why? Do you think any of these models could help you lead an active lifestyle that includes some form of physical activity? Now, before I finish, I want to leave you with some practical tips and ideas to get you moving. Now, my first practical tip is to start small, particularly if you've been inactive for a while. So I would suggest you start with a 5-minute walk, say around the block each day for about a week. Then in the second week, maybe consider increasing the time to 7.5 minutes 10 minutes in the third week, and then so on. So this is called the 10% rule, or the principle of progression, where you gradually increase your training load 10% each week, whether this is weights or distance or intensity or time. And essentially that's what that example is about, where you increase by 10%. My second practical tip is to identify a goal that's achievable. For example, you may want to run the New York or London Marathon, or maybe you want to be able to walk the Overland Trail in Tasmania, which is a 65-kilometre one-way trek through the heart of Cradle Mountain and Lake Sinclair National Park in Tasmania. Beautiful trail. Done it before. It's fantastic. Now, my point is that having a goal is really important, particularly as it connects to my third point, which I'm just about to tell you about. And my third practical tip relates to the acronym known as FIT principle. That's FITT. And that stands for frequency, intensity, time, and type. So let's have a look at each one very quickly. So the first one, or the first acronym, F, which stands for frequency. Now, this refers to how often you should exercise each week. For example, you may choose 3 times a week, say a Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, to engage in some form of physical activity. Now to I. Now, I stands for intensity. Now, this indicates how hard you should aim to work during each planned session. Now, normally, this is calculated as a percentage of your maximum heart rate, so then you can calculate different heart rate zones. To determine your maximum heart rate, you subtract your age from 220. For example, a 20-year-old's estimated maximum heart rate would be 200 beats per minute, and the example there would be 220 minus the 20-year-old's age, which is 200. That's how you get the figure of 200 beats per minute as the maximum heart rate. Now, to determine each training zone, it's a percentage of your maximum heart rate. For example, training zone 1, which is a very light physical activity, is 60 to 65%, which equates to 120 to about 130 beats per minute. Now, if you're wondering, the moderate activity range, or zone 3, is 75 to 82%, or 150 to 164 beats per minute. Now, I mention that because obviously I was talking earlier about moderate physical activity. And then, of course, I don't want to forget vigorous activity. And so for the vigorous activity range, or zone 4, this represents 82 to 89%, or 164 to 174 beats per minute for a 20-year-old. That's how you calculate some of those intensity ranges. And the third acronym of the FIT principle is time. Now, this refers to the duration of each workout session. For example, you might aim for a 30-minute cardio session on the treadmill or on the stepper at the gym, for instance. And then the last acronym of the FIT principle is type. Now, this refers to the specific kind of exercise you're going to do in your planned session. For example, if you're training for a marathon, then of course, then this is the type of exercise you really need to be doing, and that's, of course, running. Now, the FIT principle can be quite a useful guide, particularly when it's connected with a specific goal, and that's why I mentioned the two together. Now, my point is, having a goal is really important if the FIT principle is going to work for you, because it will determine how you work towards achieving your goal. And that's why I think it's quite useful to combine the two together. Now, my fourth practical tip is to consider low-impact exercise or physical activity. Now, I mention this option because I know that there are many people out there who are not interested in achievement-orientated type goals, or they have injuries that limit what they can do, which means pretty much low-impact exercise or physical activity, like walking, may be a viable option to consider. It's actually quite a serious option for a lot of people, and sometimes the only option. Indeed, I know from talking to people like Sludge and Turbo at the pub that they carry with them old footy injuries, which limit what they can do. So the other day I introduced and mentioned to them something that's called Japanese walking, which is a form of low-impact exercise or physical activity, which is great for anyone who finds it hard to engage in high-intensity type or high-intensity types of physical activity. At first, they seemed really skeptical about Japanese walking because they questioned how can you get benefit from something we do all day, right, which is walking. But after explaining the technique and some of the research findings and how it works, they did indicate to me that they would prepare to give it a go and then report back to me the next time I see them. Now, knowing Sludge and Turbo, they will not hold back on their feedback when I see them in person. So what's Japanese walking then, you're probably wondering? Well, Japanese walking technique, so-called because the original 2007 research was conducted in Japan, hence the name Japanese walking, is simple and it's backed by a considerable body of evidence. And how it works is like this. You walk for 3 minutes at a late to childcare pickup pace, or maybe a late to a meeting, or anything that's really kind of high tempo. And then you slow down for 3 minutes and then repeat this pattern for no fewer than 5 rounds or 5 cycles or 5 sets. And ideally, you want to do this for 30 minutes. Now, think of it like interval walking. For example, 3 minutes of continuous high-tempo intense walking, that is hard work. And then 3 minutes off of continuous walking that allows you to recover and then go again. Now, there is no rigid rules around the 3 minute on and the 3 minute off periods. And so if you want to ease into it, say with 1 minute on and 1 minute off, then I say go for it. At the end of the day, it's about getting out there and just giving it a go and find something that you enjoy doing. And I guess that's one of the attractive features of Japanese walking. There is some flexibility in there in terms of the technique. Now, my last practical tip relates to reframing physical activity, like walking for different goals. Now, beyond the known health and well-being benefits of walking, I want to challenge anyone who is listening to this episode who may be skeptical. And I want them to kind of see walking as something that can enhance creativity and problem solving. Stress relief, maybe it's a de-stressing way for them to kind of cope with the stresses of their life. And it provides an opportunity to socially connect with others who are walking with you. So it can be quite social aspect and have quite a social component. In fact, some of my favourite walks or some of my favourite trails that I've done with people has actually been with people. And of course, really, at a workplace, they actually can be productive. So if this is about productivity, well, then it definitely can be conducive to productive outcomes. Indeed, it's on this point I want to finish by challenging any managers or leaders out there who may be listening to this podcast. And I want to say this to them: consider maybe experimenting with walking meetings, because they actually will boost productivity. And I know from my own personal experiences of experimenting with walking meetings that, first of all, they're very productive, but then secondly, all the people who've been at the meeting with me on the walking meeting have all reported that they've actually really enjoyed just doing something different, particularly when you do the walking meeting in a green space. Like, for instance, where I work, we're near the Botanical Gardens, and it's a fantastic green space. So I would just kind of encourage anyone just to try and give it a go, do something different. And I think I might leave it there. So let's recap the main points. I want to leave you with a few takeaway points. Physical activity in the form of walking can actually really enhance creativity and problem solving, and actually have a positive impact on our physical and mental health. And it's actually part of a very rich historical and intellectual tradition. Now, beyond these known benefits, physical activity has the potential to be transformative in the sense that it can change you in positive ways that can be good for you. Now, the case for physical activity in reducing physical health problems is actually quite well established. However, there's been a growing interest in the contribution of physical activity in the alleviation of mental health problems. And physical activity has been shown to improve both physical and mental health and actually well-being of many individuals. And given the known benefits of physical activity on health and well-being, it's actually worth promoting physical activity in its various forms because it can actually improve a person's overall health and well-being. Now, on the question of step counts and how many steps you should aim for each day, look, there's limited scientific evidence to support 10,000 steps as the optimal number of steps for health benefits. And the focus should actually be more on time spent doing the physical activity over step counts. And as I've mentioned earlier, the World Health Organization recommends adults should do at least 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity or 75 minutes of vigorous activity every week. That's vigorous aerobic activity every week. As a general guide, think of moderate activity as any physical activity that gets your heart beating faster and actually makes you breathe harder, but still allows you to carry a conversation with, say, someone who's with you. Now, think brisk walk as an example. As for vigorous aerobic activity, this is the type of exercise that significantly elevates your heart rate and breathing, making it difficult to say more than a few words without pausing for a breath. So if you're with someone, it can actually be very difficult to hold a conversation. So that's what you should be thinking of when you're thinking of vigorous aerobic activity. So just think jogging and running. Now, when it comes to the feel-good effect of physical activity, it's important to note that most healthy individuals report stable or increasing levels of pleasure during exercise that's typically followed by further improvements during the post-exercise period. That's that feel-good effect that I talked about earlier. To keep people physically active and to benefit from the effects of physical activity, it must be pleasant, whatever that may mean for an individual. When it is not pleasurable, dropout is likely to happen, leading to even poorer states of physical conditioning and a continuation of a vicious cycle of inactivity. This is why a comprehensive approach to physical activity has to speak to all sides of the human equation. So that's the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, not one over the other. And that's just why I wanted to instigate, at least in this episode, what I call a counter movement of sorts that approaches physical activity as a form of play that is both necessary, inherently meaningful, and valuable to the individual as part of the good life. Now, the potential of physical activity to transform someone's life for the better should not be underestimated at all. Some common themes emerge here around the transformation that involve aspects of forging a subjective identity through repeated encounters with a place and its inherent requirements. Understanding why we engage in physical activity and what we could become or be is crucial for forming active lifestyles that are self-sustaining and personally satisfying. I outlined 4 models of an active lifestyle that are actually worth serious consideration, and these were the strenuous life, the sensuous life, the spiritual or transformed life, or a life of excellence. Here we find 4 representations of the things we value that have implications for our health and well-being that are actually worth serious consideration. Now, and then I finish with some practical tips and ideas to get you moving. The first practical tip being the 10% rule. The second practical tip being the importance of having goals. And the third practical tip being the FIT principle, which is actually quite a useful guide for achieving those goals that I mentioned. And the fourth practical tip was low impact exercise or physical activity like walking, such as Japanese walking. And my last practical tip was to reframe physical activity like walking for different goals. So there you have it. The transformative power of something as simple as putting one foot in front of the other. The path to becoming a better person might literally be a path waiting for you outside. I challenge you this week, take a walk. Not for exercise, not for your step count, but as an act of self-discovery. Pay attention to what shifts in your mind as your body moves. Notice what emerges when you give yourself that gift of movement and space. If today's episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it. Share your walking revelations, your hiking breakthroughs, or simply let me know how movement has moved you. Until next time, keep thinking deeply, keep moving forward, and remember, sometimes the most profound transformation begins with the simplest step. This has been Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and tell others about my podcast. Until next time, stay curious and think deeply. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to producer Luke Watson, aka Producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie, who once again has worked his magic behind the scenes to bring this episode to life. Luke's attention to detail, creative input, and genuine care for the message that we've been trying to share makes all the difference. He doesn't just produce these episodes, he helps craft them into something meaningful. I couldn't do it without you, and so here's to many more episodes together. Thanks, mate.